coming up on our last chat of the day on digital media and warfare. This will be moderated by Dr. Paul Edgar. Dr. Edgar is an associate director of the Clements Center here at UT. He holds a PhD in Middle Eastern culture and languages from UT following a 22-year career in the U.S. Army. Dr. Edgar is a polyglot, and I can speak to his educational methods when he co-taught a class and asked every single student a lesson from the Vietnam War, and a lot of participation trophies during that lesson based on our class. So everyone, here's our last chat of the day, Dr. Paul Edgar.
So we're right smack in the middle of a 3-day monster conference. Thank you to the CREES team for doing this and all of your co-sponsors. We're certainly proud at the Clements Center to have been a part of this, a very small part of it, but certainly you have outdone yourself, Michelle. This has been a fantastic conference so far. I know another 24 hours to go, but really respect what you've done with this operation. So, okay, so welcome everybody here in the audience and on our digital audience. So we are, I'm not sure what the size of our digital audience is, but we're glad that you're here as well. And our theme for today is, or for this next hour, is digital media and the future of warfare. And I'll briefly introduce my panelists, and if we get into the conversation, you want to learn a little bit more about what they've done, when we come to the Q&A time, please certainly feel free to ask. But our four panelists, first is Jessica Dawson, here to my immediate left, and she is the Information Warfare Research Team Division Chief. This is from West Point, okay, part of our military, and so it has a very long and distinguished title. But
standard disclaimers apply.
Right. We should reduce that to an acronym. But Division Chief at the Army Cyber Institute and an associate professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Go Army, beat Navy. She has a distinguished career in addition to this, spanning 3 decades as an enlisted and commissioned service member in the Army. To our one to the left of Jessica is Mike Allison. Currently serves as the Senior Intelligence Advisor for the Army Futures Command here in Austin and has been here a couple of years now. He also has a career that spans 3 decades of uniformed and civilian service in the infantry as a foreign area officer and for the past 10 plus years in the intelligence community. And then all the way to the far left, no pun intended, all right. I guess I'm on the far right. I'm on the far right, Kiril's on the far left. So Kiril Avramov really probably needs no introduction to this audience. He is one of UT's own. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies and a fellow at the Intelligence Studies Project, a project that is sponsored by the Clements Center and the Strauss Center. He holds courtesy appointments at the Department of Government and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And perhaps most famously, especially among our students, Kiril is the co-director of the Global Disinformation Lab, the local term is GDIL, and has really done a fantastic job with that and provided so many opportunities for not just for learning, but for production of real world usable intelligence products done by undergraduate students and graduate students. So anyways, we have a very distinguished panel that is ready to take on this theme. So before we jump into the future, I thought that we could look at the problem in at least more simply, maybe for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then open it up. So before jumping into the future and how digital media may influence the future of warfare in multiple directions, we often think, and maybe this crowd is beyond this because you've been sitting here for the past couple of days. We think of information one-dimensionally sometimes. For example, and at least it seems less threatening when it's one-dimensional. If my credit card data is leaked, It's a hassle, but it's certainly not something that is a national security threat. And so we think of sort of individual pieces of information, or maybe with a credit card, a couple pieces of information that are compromising, a hassle, maybe a little bit more than that in the worst case situation, but does not rise to the level of a national security threat. Let's try to look beyond that, though. And Jessica, I thought we could start with you. Can you sort of take a few minutes to describe and characterize the information that is available digitally, especially through digital media, and thus collected or collectible? And I'll give you 2 questions at a time if that's all right. Can you describe a little bit about how it can be aggregated, refined, and corroborated, and how that can make it more useful?
So I'm going to, right off the bat, nod to my intelligence colleague and say I'm not an intelligence officer. So when we use the word collected, in intelligence circles, it's different than what like Google and Facebook are collecting on you. So we're going to have some disagreement about terminology. But I think the biggest threat that I think we face right now is all of the data that is collected on each of us individually. Hannah Arendt, put this very well in her Origins of Totalitarianism, that the goal of the totalitarian regime is to break us apart into atomized individuals. And you'll hear a lot of folks say, oh, you just have to hide in the data. You just have to look like everyone else. Well, that's not possible anymore because you can be zeroed in on and drilled down to. So what do I mean by that? Very famously, Target, who cares, what Target gets on me if they know what I'm buying, right? Well, very famously, Target, and this is almost 20 years ago now, had developed an algorithm using 26 items. I don't think anybody's ever publicly reported on what those 26 items were, to figure out that you were pregnant. And then they could start marketing to you, right? And they had to figure out how to do it in such a way that wasn't going to really skeeve people out, because there's that famous story of the dad that got all, bent out of shape because, they were getting advertisements for pregnancy, and it turned out his daughter was pregnant. She hadn't told him yet. So what? Okay, Target knows you're pregnant. Well, when you also think about the vulnerabilities and the major life transitions that people go through, targeting you, pun intended, for influence, and if we can shift your shopping habits while you're pregnant and postpartum, we're probably going to capture you for life, right? Again, shopping, okay, but let's look at the broader problem of selling vaccine hesitancy, selling, supplements, selling people to not go to the doctor, selling people mental health issues, selling people extremism, radicalization. All of the data that is collected on you by your phone, by your internet searches, that is sold by all of the companies that you interact with every single day. Fun fact, your medical data has been collected, and if it's outside of a HIPAA-controlled agency, it's no longer protected medical information. So the big data brokers, Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax, probably have medical data on you. Well, that gets really complicated really fast when you start thinking about, well, I thought that was protected information. Well, how can that then be exploited? So when we think about all of the data that's out there, your name and your social security number and your credit card information, those are protected information, but those aren't really the biggest concerns. All of the vulnerabilities that you have, are you dealing with mental health issues? Are your kids dealing with mental health issues? I can talk, I promise. All of the different vulnerabilities that you might have, some that are highly stigmatized, some that aren't, are available now to be targeted on. Jess, can go into Google and start doing ads based on the apps that you have on your phone. If you're gay and you're not out, and I want to start targeting people that are at a military installation that are potentially gay and not out but have Grindr on their phone, I can do that. Think about now the targeted possibilities for blackmail, for extortion, for all of the traditional, counterintelligence threats that are out there. This is done through regular advertising now. So I think that if we can set that stage of, this isn't just about selling sneakers. If it was just about selling sneakers, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. Right.
So in fact, if you and Michael both maybe could comment, you brought up counterintelligence efforts or counterintelligence efforts, right? So how now can this be transformed, if you can expand a little bit more, into a national security issue?
You want to take that?
Sure, and I appreciate the early disclaimer, Jessica. Thank you. So, and one additional disclaimer so I can be here. These are my opinions. They're not right. They're not the government's opinions. They're not the U.S. Army's opinions, and they do not represent the opinions of Army Futures Command. So that is where I live, and that is who I am. So it is based on experiences. So it is all the things that Jessica said. If you walk through the vulnerabilities of if your information is had, what can someone do with it? In the counterintelligence realm, it does create a vulnerability. And it creates a vulnerability in national security because it can and likely will be exploited. Now that depends on where you stand in the hierarchy, the access to information you have, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go too far into the weeds on intel gunk, but that is a serious national security concern, and it is the source of the best intelligence that everyone is after. Us, the Russians, the Chinese. If it's a country with a name on it, if it's a non-state actor, even if it's a really sophisticated, superpowered corporation, they're going to get that information and they're going to utilize it to their gain, to their advantage. For us, national security questions specifically, you don't want that vulnerability. So you do have to counter that. That's more defensive, it's passive, it's training, it's enforcing standards, et cetera, all real boring stuff. But once it's out there, just like Jessica said, you can do anything with it you want, and it makes you very vulnerable, and it creates a number of holes in national security. So I'll stop there. There's some other points I think when we get later into the conversation, we can elaborate more on some of that.
Let me pose this to both of you then. At this point, we're talking about potential threats to national security, especially in terms of counterintelligence operations or vulnerabilities. Does any of this, can we use any of this that we've discussed so far to go so far as to that it would, the consequences would be an act of war? Or is this still sort of gray zone or preliminaries to war at this point?
I'll go first, and it's not because I'm brave, because I think you're going to get better answers from my two colleagues. No, because it hasn't been leveraged as an act of war, but it has certainly elevated conflicts, crisis, and I think this is going to be a huge problem going forward. So at some point, and I'll get to this towards the end of the discussion, we're going to be in a place that we are not prepared to deal with, and we're going to have to redo all of this. There were some brilliant presentations yesterday and over the course of today, some encouraging words. Oh, it'll take a while, but we'll get through this. We don't have a while, and at some point, I'll posit, just to provoke thought, this will become an act of war, and it will escalate conflicts. So I'll leave you in that bad place and turn it over to the real experts.
All right. Well, Jessica, let me ask you the next questions. And again, you've already touched on some of this. Who has the information already? Again, we're sort of at step one. We'll talk about sort of the horizon of what's available digitally shortly. But right now, who has access to this information en masse? And then what kind of malign actors can get it or do get it, and how does that transfer occur?
So there's a couple of different ways. First of all, this is really cheap and anybody can access it. If you can access Google ads and start running Google ads, it's really, really cheap to do. You can do the same thing with Facebook ads. So any of the platforms you can run ads on. We've put out, we conducted a study with our partners at Duke to go out, and their charter was go buy data on the military and tell us what you find, right? We don't want to know what it is because there's some concerns there, right? But like, go tell us what you bought, and what are the vulnerabilities there, and let's assess the vulnerabilities there. So
almost a contracted red team exercise in a sense.
And so essentially, what they were able to get back should not be a surprise to anyone in the room. Names, addresses, family members, religion, political situations, children in the home. So all of that is purchasable, right? Well, what do you do with that? You take that list of names, you upload it into Google or Facebook, and you can start running ads targeted at that list, or you can run ads targeted at lookalikes at that list. So if I want to start scooping up information about vulnerabilities inside of the military, It's really easy to do. And anybody with a credit card can do this. That's the thing as you're talking about, the Russian influence operations in the previous two panels, and they can do this with a credit card. There is nothing stopping them from going on there and running ads and targeted information towards the American populace. And that is the real concern, is because once they get into our ecosystem, once they get on our networks, General Nakasone was testifying in front of Congress that once they get on our networks, once they get inside the backbone of Microsoft or Amazon or what have you, we can't go hunting on the network for them. So it's a real problem that, we've got foreign adversaries accessing directly into the media and cognitive ecosystem of our society, absolutely exploiting all of those vulnerabilities, turning all of the friction and chaos up to 11. And how do we stop them?
Especially when it's a commercial activity.
Because the platforms are not incentivized to protect democracy. The platforms are incentivized to make money.
Right.
That's their job.
Right. Narrowing down preferences to prod somebody into a purchase. Right. But preferences are not just for products. Preferences are for a number of things. Right. And then you can kind of push those things in certain directions.
I mean, if we look at one of the earliest, Russian influence ops in the U.S. in the new platforms, it was the Jade Helm dust up in 2015, right? So they got a whole bunch of folks that were, really worried about what was the Army doing in Texas? Is this a dry run to take over Texas? And the governor wanted to, activate, the National Guard to follow the troops around, and it's like that was a test run, and it worked. And so they were clearly able to see that they could reach into, people that are, a little bit extra paranoid and find them in the social media space and then activate them.
Right. I think anybody would have a hard time taking over Texas. I don't recommend it, by the way. Yes. They are absolutely tapping into and provoking a predisposition.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go from, we're kind of deliberately move from the commercial level to intelligence, and maybe Michael and Kiril, you both can be the first to respond. So we've seen this explosion in the past, certainly in the past decade, and maybe even more recently than that, in what we call open source intelligence. And much of this, not all of it, but much of it is mined from digital media. We use, so we're taking, in some ways, the same information, but now applying it, kind of corroborating it, et cetera, in a different way, or perhaps for a different purpose, to learn things. So can you describe, Kiril, why don't we start with you, and then Michael, if you can add to it. Can you describe how digital media and data collection has somewhat revolutionized, this is not a new intelligence field, but it's been revolutionized by the amount of intelligence or information, bits of information that can be corroborated into intelligence, that has been put in the pipeline, so to speak. The pipeline has been enlarged and accelerated. So can you describe that, and then what are the opportunities, challenges, and risks?
Well, thank you very much. And if you allow me, I would like just to chime in before I start on the previous discussion about the opportunities that are open right now with this deluge of data. Let's not forget that all influence operations, after all, are based on one or two insights of behavioral science. And here is the time to actually thank Jessica for the privilege and GDL colleagues that I see that we have collaborated with Army Cyber on looking beyond the horizon in exercises such as stratcasting. So thank you very much for passing, this technology.
Bureaucracy for the win.
Thank you. I honestly, after some of our sessions with our Army colleagues, walked out, and so some of our products reflect that, joint products that we have published, about this phenomenon, which is called micro-targeting. And I believe that what Jessica was describing of being able to drill down to individual service members and to apply this to what me and Mike are asked right now to address, analytic tradecraft and personnel. I literally think that we're seeing a silent revolution, at least in the field of intelligence, at least in two magistral ways, with this availability of data. One, it is the ability of unfiltered, unstructured data to be accessed not only by outfits such as Bellingcat or any other think tanks, which have been hugely beneficial, in uncovering, a lot of disinformation or influence operations that have been there. However, with this commercialization of this OSINT, and when you top on everything else, things that already have happened, however, escaped, the public attention. Jessica mentioned the big data brokers. Now, can I just gently remind everyone that if we, as we have built with Army Cyber, a dateline back to the big data breaches on American individuals, and if you superimpose those and correlate them, you'll see that China, in this case, allegedly, was very interested in medical data, for one, credit scores, habits, and so on. Those are the big sort of breakthroughs. Again, we're not, selling our publication, but we're trying to show something what is going beyond the horizon. Add to this, the famous, I believe, it's been already said here in the panel, but famous statement by Mr. Putin, whoever controls AI, controls the future, in his abnormal interest in autonomous weapons and so on, just as a game equalizer. So what does that mean for the field of OSINT as a field, like game changer in the field of intel? It's a double-edged sword. On one end, it allows us to inform and pre-bunk, as we've seen here with, let's say, with Biden administration and so on, certain moves, and leverage the capacity, of the scope and reach of data to prevent. However, going back to the Chinese examples, that literally changes the tradecraft. So much biometric data, so much ubiquitous surveillance, it inevitably, will have to bring, to a pragmatic shift of how, we deal with classified data on one end, and now that we're talking about, unfortunately, we see something in the media floating, and, who has access to it and who doesn't, and what the public, can make, because it can tip the scales as well. To in a bigger scope and a bigger picture, to be influenced by what we would call BS, polluted data, and this polluted data, to be used up into the decision-making process through the process of crafting intelligence products. After all, with all the gatekeeping and checks and balances, we're dealing with human beings, and they have their own biases, and that can have. I believe also, I'm a little bit of a pessimist, can lead us on a path to conflict as an act of war very quickly. We're going into a territory, as yesterday we were talking about, with the large language models, relatively, stable speed of falling costs of obtaining all of this data, legally or illegally, and leveraging it into a complex operations, which support in parallel kinetic operations or standalone missions, is brave new world right there.
What about you, Michael? What are your thoughts on the? Because you've been you've been seeing intelligence for a long time. I don't want to say how long, but you've been working with intelligence for a long time.
You can out me, Paul. It's been a long. I'm an old man. A quarter of a century.
The OSINT revolution. What are your observations?
So I'm going to take advantage of both sets of comments and hedge off of them a little bit. So the first thing I'll say is I'll take the middle ground and say that at least as far as the intelligence community is concerned, specific to OSINT, there's one common misperception, and then there isn't really a revolution going on. Part of the problem, and that could be wrong, is when a revolution is occurring, you often don't know that you're right in the middle of it. The digital revolution is obvious. It has been going on for quite some time. If you want to use the word ubiquitous, and my colleagues will tell you that's a triggering word for me, so I don't like it. But there's a lot, okay? You can get it anytime you want. but it overwhelms the intelligence community. It's just more information. So this gets to the common misperception that open source intelligence is not used in the intelligence community. That's patently wrong. It is a huge part of intelligence analysis. It's put in. What do I have access to? If it's on the digital divide, I can get it. I have it. And the database is filled in near real time. I can go get any of it at last count, and my information is at least 5 years old. There are 139 separate tools I can use as an analyst to go get it, to refine it, and to give it to me. So there's a lot going on, and the technology that's behind all of this digital revolution is hyper accelerating that revolution. So can the intelligence community keep up?
Right.
It's a monumental struggle, and there's possibly things, but you mentioned that the opportunities and the challenges that go with that. So maybe where the intelligence community is potentially on the verge of revolutionizing is I can make it and my access to that do things for me. So I can come in each day or come in at night or on the weekend, and I'm making it give me the information that I think I need to focus on. I can't write algorithms, and I lack any of the expertise that Jessica and probably even Kiril have. But that's a powerful tool for me as an individual, as a senior analyst, as a supervisor, on and on it goes. So that's a big opportunity. So I can make it come to me, but what does that give me the advantage to do? I can do a lot more, and I can do it a lot faster. What does that output create? A demand for even more. So when the standard is infinity, you're not going to meet the standard. And this causes severe issues with cognition. And I liked where Kiril kind of ended up. This information, this intelligence, this analysis is all part of a bigger picture of sense making, okay? And that has to be delivered at the end of all of that to a human being. Human beings can't do all this stuff that we're talking about. They simply can't. Now, there's other advantages and disadvantages of that, but what I would say is, here's where it goes a little bit off the rails. It's increasingly bringing us into this concept of real time. That, I think, is where we can declare the revolution. If we get there, and we do not have the technology and computing power to do that yet, and we can talk more about that, there's... Can
you expand on that a little bit more so that everybody gets what you mean?
Yeah, so if I'm trying to inform a commander to make decisions, what I need to give him or her is battlefield awareness, a read of the terrain, the weather, the enemy forces, all of this information that I have any number of ways to get. By the way, a lot of which I can scrape off of digital media easily, okay? And that has consequences. Hopefully we get to that later on. But that all goes in to lay that picture out, and it has to be updated in real time. And whoever's going to do this faster is going to have what we like to call decision advantage. That's where you want to go. Okay, the commercial industry is doing this better than anyone else right now. Okay, so can we, as a military, keep up? I mean, all modern militaries are trying to do this, but even militias and non-state actors are getting better at it as well. So that's really the rub. But you know, the risk. I'll give one historical example, and then I'll leave it for towards the end of the discussion. But on the evening of May 6th into the morning of May 7th, 1999, during the Kosovo conflict, coming up on 24 years ago, almost exactly, 4 GPS-guided bombs hit their target, their intended targets, nailed them. The target was a weapons factory in Belgrade. So it hit. The problem was that information, while carefully selected, going into a target deck, curated, not so well, was wrong, because what it hit was the Chinese embassy, and it killed 3 Chinese nationals, and it caused an international uproar. And the blood was on the hands of NATO and all the commanders making that decision. It shut down air operations for 3 full weeks until in Belgrade, not the entirety of the theater, but it shut that down. Now, you take that up to a high-intensity conflict where you have to have real-time situational awareness. Just think about that for a second. You've not only lost your advantage, if you had built any momentum, you just lost all of it. So,
especially when you're sensitive to collateral damage, right? When you're sensitive to to hitting non-military targets on accident.
Ideally,
Right.
There's other
Which we are.
unfortunate examples, but yeah, I think every military tries not to do that. Now, Ukraine not so much, but we've already talked about that till we can't talk about it anymore. So I know that's a lot, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to answer that.
Well, that's actually a really good segue to. I thought that we would spend maybe 10 or 15 minutes in the moment, right? And then go into the future. We've spent about 30 minutes in the moment, and now we'll go into the future. So let's complicate the picture even further. We've been talking about digital information, much of it conveyed through digital media, that is conveying true or factual information. For example, the geographical marker and the date time stamp on my photo on Twitter might be correct, right? Or correct right now, so that's good information. Can you describe the intentional use over digital media of bad information, incorrect information, deceptive information, and let's and add to that what may be doable right now with cutting edge technology or in the very near future, so that we're really considering the future of war. And Jessica, why don't we start with you on that? Because I know you had some thoughts and comments that we talked about or that we corresponded about over the past few days.
I mean, I think the overall argument that you have to win the information fight in order to win the kinetic fight is critical. You can look at multiple issues in the last 20 years that we won on the ground, but we lost in the information fight. And so as we think about where this is going in the future, right? If we're not able to determine what the reality is on the ground, if we're not going to pause and actually try to figure out what happened, if we don't care who we hit, that's going to either speed up our adversary's momentum and slow us down, or and probably not in the inverse, as long as we remain a nation that at least is partially guided by values, right? We don't like to kill civilians for fun, right? That's not something that we train our officers to do. It's not something that we advocate for. Other militaries are not that way. And so it does give us a distinct disadvantage in the kinetic fight, but we have to figure out how do we tackle this so that we can turn that into an advantage. Because the minute we become, butchers is the minute we lose.
Right. If I can try to tie in a few things here, the panel that or the discussion that preceded us, and Mark Pomar's work. I think Mark Pomar is still here, right? So one of the things that Mark emphasized with his work with Voice of America, et cetera, is that they weren't trying to spin the truth. They were simply trying to tell the truth. And sometimes I think that is something that we can have as our advantage if we're able to sort of operationalize it fast enough, right? And do it well enough. So that if we think our values are universally appreciated, of valuing human life, human life enough that you avoid as much as possible collateral damage or anything in that range, the information that we put out on digital media, if it's fast enough to the right audience, can be a powerful tool in winning the peace, right?
I mean, I think has anybody in here watched The Boys on Amazon? It's a great show if you haven't watched it. The second season has a character named Stormfront, and yes, she is a Nazi. But she shows Homelander how to basically turn the meme war around and how to, get her army of trolls to turn the meme war around. And that is one of the things that, we as this dignified institution struggle with is, we don't necessarily want to assume the risk. I think someone mentioned it took us like 2 weeks to approve a meme. Well, that's silly, right? Like that is not how we're going to win in this fight. So we have to recognize that somewhat of the playing field has changed, right? Things that are stupid are actually very effective weapons, right? Like TikTok is a very effective weapon. And we need to acknowledge that. And it's a weapon on a couple of different levels. One, it's getting directly into the bloodstream of our children and their psyche. It's also collecting lots of data on them, and it's enabling China to gain advantage in their machine learning data that they're gathering, hard coding it and enriching it and then using it to build their algorithms, right? The difference, and people keep bringing up that China's going to win in the AI fight. Well, what does that mean? I suspect if you ask the Uyghurs how they feel about China winning in the AI fight, that's going to have a very different answer than what we're going to say. Because winning in that space means control, it means domination, and it doesn't mean freedom to innovate and to criticize your government. If that's what we think winning means, I don't want it.
So I smiled partway into your comment because it reminded me of a good Army saying, right? That if it's stupid but it works, it's not stupid, right? So is there a way that we can, these things that we are maybe not our initial reaction, but our second reaction, like TikTok, is to loathe and step away from, if there's a way that we can embrace and use it or manipulate it in a constructive way. Is that sort of what you have in mind, or is that going down a different path?
I mean, I think that the deeper risk with TikTok is the data collection, right? So there is no way to be on that platform and avoid the data collection. That's the problem, right? So when we think about where our kids are and how do we reach them where they are, there's no way to do that while mitigating the risk of the data collection. And I don't have an answer there, right? What the CEO is talking about is like loading it into American servers and keeping it away from Chinese engineers and everything. Maybe, but
still be siphoned.
It's
one way or another, right?
But I think so. The problem becomes: is the risk worth the reward there? I'm not so sure, because when we look at all the genetic data that China has collected from prenatal tests, all of the data broker data that they've gotten, we don't know what they're going to do with that. Right. We don't actually know what they're going to do with that now and in the future. That is worth taking a step back and considering the risks, because we don't necessarily know what that looks like.
Right. Well, good. Well, so let me give you one more chance to talk about winning the information fight. Right. Then is that where do you see the United States failing or perhaps making some strides towards having a capacity in the digital media space to win the information fight? Kind of writ broadly, not a particular fight, for example, Eastern Europe right now, but more broadly, just as a capacity.
We have to define what we're trying to win.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and we have to really, figure out what is it that end state looks like, and that means that if winning, if we're using it in the traditional sense, means we lay down our arms and we stop fighting. Well, that's how we end up with the backlash that we're facing right now with black rights and women's rights and gay rights and all of this backlash that's going on right now. Is because we stopped fighting. We won. Yay. So we don't have to keep telling the story about why this is important and why why diversity matters, right? We can't even get leadership to say that this stuff matters for innovation purposes. So we have to define what winning looks like, and then we have to figure out what that core meta narrative is that the United States is telling. And we've kind of been on our heels with this for a while. We've got folks that say this is the greatest nation ever, and we've never done anything wrong. This is a nation that's built on slavery, and it's horrible, and we're never going to do anything right. Well, no, there's a middle path there that we can look up at the promise that this nation is and acknowledge that we haven't always lived up to that. But we have to tell people what they're fighting for and what this nation represents. And that is the story that we tell. And that's what winning the information fight looks like, is that people understand that and they can deal with criticism and they can address it and they can face it. Because if we can't get laughed at, we're in a lot of trouble, right? And that, I think, is one of the big challenges.
So, and that's in a domestic it's absolutely national security, but we're looking at a domestic audience there. What would you say to our capacities? For example, say we have another occupation in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I'm not trying to bring everybody down here, right? What I'm just saying, say there's a justified occupation for something. We tried to win the information fight in Iraq, in Afghanistan, with varying levels of success at different moments. What about our capacities to project and win the information fight with digital media in a foreign location?
Pass.
All right, we'll go to Kiril.
Okay, I'll step in because, first of all, there are, again, I would like to applaud some of the efforts, done by the defense community and especially the Army. All of us regularly participate in the Mad Scientist series. And one of the most captivating things, and because I see people in the audience like Sasha Rojavin and people that we've participated in challenges, multiple ones. One of the key elements that Jessica mentioned, and I think it should be understood very well, because in the context of information war, first of all, like what does that look for? What is the end state? What's a win? Right. But if we're looking at the very process, in essence, from our perspective as academics, actually, as in those series that we participated in those challenges, there is a very compelling, side of the story to look at those internet or to separate, the purely technical tricks, if you will, of how, you can change, have a behavioral change, to separate it from the cognitive battle, because here I believe we're talking about a whole new level of battle of cognition, and that leads everything else that we were talking about. So what does, in my mind, does that look like? Well, it's a battle of narratives and meta-narratives. In order to win, and I think that there is a wealth of information. The U.S. Army actually has done a lot of work on seeking to influence the battles of hearts and minds, which is a super disputed, right, like term, whether we should use it or not. But I would prefer the battle of narratives, which means is a battle for meaning. Not the platform itself. Risks, we all know about it. Like the short answer that you and Mike will give you, false flags. And, this is the catastrophe that we're, facing with deepfakes or anything like this. I think Jessica mentioned, like if the worst that can happen, is a revenge porn, that can happen now. Imagine, if you're having fatwas or you're having, any other things incendiary, which can be thrown, and then the attribution is problematic because, as Max says, it has to be done almost near real time, because, we're at the stage where what we have here, right, is millions of years of evolution, and one scientist calls, I'm quoting, it's like our monkey brains, working with advanced technology. So because we have all those, cognitive biases that would, are very helpful in our daily lives. However, they impede sometimes, the sensory overload that we can have. So it's a battle of meaning. What are we trying to project? And this is a perennial problem, even in the ongoing conflict. In order to penetrate, I was listening very carefully, right, to the population that's been targeted by, like in this case, Russia or so on, and to just pierce it, you have to have an upper hand in the narrative. And I think Jitman and her team have done, tremendous strides and work, from practitioner and academic perspective. But if we don't engage, as you pointed out correctly, no, we won. Yeah, we're technically, advanced. Why should I even bother, convincing you in the superiority or so on of these values or the benefits? No need to explain. You should be, and you are talking to people, which are having ever, decreasing attention spans, which will get much more from TikTok or whoever picks it up there or any other platform. And you were trying to sort of explain complex, abstract at that problems, connected to universal values, and unless you don't have the right carrier, the right message, and the right meaning, how to decode it, because it's cross-cultural, people like Jessica here are critical, because you're dealing with societies, we're not dealing, we're living people, that we need to reach to. And if you disengage this whole part, I think another revolution is probably, in the field of psychological warfare. This is where I'm seeing.
I think you're right that there are some connections here that we haven't completely teased out yet. And here we won't be able to do it here, but with conventional, what we would consider conventional deception operations, deceptions, ruses, etc. But we're at a much doing this in a much more sophisticated way through different means. Let me turn to you, Michael, with pose a question, and then so I'll pose a question to you about sort of international norms. and then we'll go through each of you and ask you for some kind of final comments on capacities that worry you, things that might be on the horizon in this space more generally, and then we'll go to a couple of questions. But so my question for you, Michael, is sort of as an analogy, we have a broad, not a perfect, but we have a broad agreement among states regarding the use of things like biological and chemical weapons, right? Again, that's not perfect, but we would say that there are certainly international norms and that most states follow those norms. Is this something that we will see in the use of data, or is this just game on from here until eternity?
So for now, it is totally game on, and it is the wildest of the Wild West, to borrow a colloquial American phrase. Use whatever phrase works for anybody else based on where you're from and your background, but completely out of control. There are no norms. I listened to this discussion about winning the information war and controlling narratives. I'm not going to say it's a waste of time, but when it comes to a conflict, which is what I want to make sure that we're able to win and do our best job to inform that. I don't know that information wars is where the answer resides. But what I would say is the norms that you mentioned about biological and chemical weapons, those are real. Now, there are people that are hedging and have violated these. I mean, chemical weapons were used in Syria. This is known. This is out there in the media sphere, and it's talked about. And it caused real actions and reactions. So there are other episodes of pretty gross violations. There have been other revelations, some of which are unfortunately fueled by intelligence leaks that discuss this. But let's fast forward to the future, and let's take it into this digital media sphere. So the awkward place that I'm going to argue that we're going into, and I'm being deliberately provocative, is we are going to see, and we already are, increased violations of the law of armed conflict. That is happening in Ukraine, and it's happened on both sides. Forgive me.
Just broadly.
For offending one. Just broadly. Yeah. But it's got 4 areas, and I'll just tick them off, and we probably need to get to it in the after party. But the 4 that I would mention is, okay, what is the law of armed conflict? I can address that rapidly. How does it apply to digital media? Unknown right now, right. Okay? There are some legal background issues you can do to apply to it. What are the concerns with the use of digital media in the conduct of future wars? And then what are some of the positives and the negatives? And when you get to that, I'll exit, if we have time, with the issue of perfidy, or its easier word to understand in 5th grade, treachery. Okay, and what are the implications of that? So the simplistic answer is, the law of armed conflict protects civilians against attack unless they are directly participating in hostilities. Well, if I'm one of the 9-year-olds crowdsourcing Russian troop movements in Ukraine with my iPhone and pumping that in, if you're lucky enough to have an iPhone, are you now a participant? Unknown. And does that make you a legitimate target for the commander operating on the battlefield? I mean, this is the ugliness and the gray area that we could potentially go into. Now, that's not ultimately the big deal, but let's magnify that on scope and scale. So the second issue is, the proliferation of digital media increasingly raises the possibility of scraping the web for information and purchasing private data that would be useful in military operations. We have numerous examples where corporate America, rightfully, has self-selected out of national security. Well, that has consequences 10, 20, 30 years from now that I don't think are well thought through yet. It can also be helpful, though, because it could actually reveal and give you insights and give you the ability that's just really key to honor this law of armed conflict, which is the ability to offer distinction on the battlefield. In other words, to get legitimate targets, to distinguish between the enemy and the civilians who should not be targeted. So I think that's enough of a start, and I'll reserve time for questions and other comments. But I do want to have the opportunity to hit that last one, and that'll be my final comment.
All right. Well, let's go to you, Jessica, and then Kiril. Just kind of final thoughts on what are some of the nascent or anything that you think we've left out that we should have touched on. I'll pose the question, but you can not answer it. You can answer the question you want to answer if you want. So, what are some of the nascent or imminent applications of data associated with digital media that concern you? Why do they concern you? Well, I'll just leave it there at this point.
So if you haven't read Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Kiril and Perez, it's an excellent look at all of the taken for granted assumptions that get captured in data. And the really famous example is, your heart attack symptoms, an elephant sitting on your chest, pain in your left side. My heart attack symptoms don't look anything like that.
Yeah.
And so women would go to the hospital and would be complaining of stomach pain or back pain or something along those lines and be sent home when they were having a heart attack.
Right.
Because we didn't train doctors to see that, and we didn't actually do the investigation to figure out that women's symptoms looked completely different.
Right.
So when we think about all of the data that exists out there, right, it's very, very, very likely, probable that it is incredibly biased, and we're going to miss half the human population. And so when we start looking at these large language models and all of this, right, I was talking to my classmates. I was like, has anybody asked ChatGPT for pregnancy advice? And it gave advice to go to a couple of different things that weren't necessarily good. Like, go to your family. Well, I don't have family that I can ask. Well, okay, well, what, it didn't give any advice. So, we're going to, the thing that scares me about all of this is the average American is functionally literate at like the 9th grade level. And when we think about the structural inequalities, the lack of access to medical doctors, the lack of access to lawyers to solve, try to solve problems, they're going to use these tech tools that are going to potentially set people up for, dramatic harms. And I mean, we've seen this already with the vaccine hesitancy, with a lot of the lies that have been propagated that have turned into real action. That's what I'm worried about moving forward. We say, oh, you have to have responsibility, et cetera, but the vast majority of Americans don't have the knowledge to be able to be literate in these spaces. We have to design the systems to be more protective and more equitable, and there's no financial incentive for that. So that's the stuff that keeps me up awake in the long term, is the bias that's in these things and the harm that's going to come to individuals that we can't hold people accountable for, because as some of the panelists have said, we don't know how these AIs work. Right. I would not
until the far end
like
when something's gone wrong.
Well, even then, we can't even explain why it came up with the answer that it came up with. I would not roll that out in high-risk situations like medical or anything like that until we can explain why it came up with what it did.
I feel like the ChatGPT answers are sort of like bad SAT essays, is how they read.
So I put my inequality questions in there. I had one of my friends do it because it wanted my phone number, and I wasn't doing that. And the answers were wrong. They were they were well written, but they were horribly wrong. So it's like, go with God. If you want to use that, go ahead. But like, you're not going to get a great.
You got a ways to go for sure. For sure. Well, thank you. And then Kiril, why don't we? You got probably 1 or 2 minutes.
Thank you.
What concerns you?
Three things, and I'll start with conflict and going towards the other spectrum. Conflict, I absolutely agree with my colleague that with this situation that we are in and ever-increasing amounts of data, which is, clean, polluted, or so on, which is used for our training sets, as we all know as academics, we see it, increasingly hard to tell friend from foe, attribution. So, are you a combatant? It is in the gray zone. And I think that with the reemergence of some of our research here in the lab as well, as we've been looking at Wagner boys and so on, and, the non-kinetic operations, which are supported by that, the guy calls himself, a political technologist, and yet, it's all about, regime change in African country, should he be targeted? Is he a participant in a conflict? Unclear. And the more we're getting, and those are the outlier examples that my colleague has provided, those are scary, right? 8-year-old, where should we put this in our daily world? Number two, I agree with Jessica also that algorithmic bias is a huge problem. The way, you're talking about the output is it actually reflects the input of the person that sits behind and curates it. The way I'm going to curate and present it, bears the same significance as Mike, to his commanding officers, or my obligations to my students, to be as objective and so on. And I think we have ample examples, not very good at, especially the one that are coming from policing, when it comes to people of color, when it comes to, a number of things. Yes, technology improves, it can see this and this and this and that. But I agree, and I'm very much, thank you for sharing this paper with us about the structural inequalities. They basically not only are inbuilt, but, they're magnified. And number three, the big one, which I think I'll side with, Yuval Harari here, it is probably the worst that I can think of is the dystopian future, where you are going to have the very well acquainted with the instrumentation and the affordances that AI and any other benefits that you can have as instruments of power by people that can use and leverage large language models, neural networks, on and on and on. Which will become a super privileged minority, which will be able to access better healthcare, be better informed, and so on. And the vast majority, and unfortunately that will be happening, here's the exploitation for, for hostile operations. If I'm an, officer, from, PRC, it'll be the first thing I'll be looking at, or, from GRU. I want to see where the discrepancies are. So those are the old tradecraft, that hasn't changed. But what has changed is that the backlash, the discontent, the lack of understanding of what are these city people are up to, or the big heads in the army, in their secret labs, what are they doing? Show me that I can touch, or talk to the algorithm, or so on. And, that should not be ridiculed or ignored, because that has political consequences.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks. I think we have time, depending on how quickly the questions are asked, we have time for probably 2 questions. Why don't we go right here and then right here? Oh, hi, Jessica.
Hello. Hi, Dr. Edgar. You stole my question about international norms, so thanks.
All right.
So I'll get more specific. So I work as a cyber intelligence analyst at Booz Allen, and I was wondering if you could maybe speak to definitions around like cyber terrorism and things like that. I know you said that, and can be any one of you. But I know you said that it's kind of the Wild West, and that's certainly true. But do you think that kind of as we saw post 9/11, different government agencies having different definitions of terrorism to fit what their spheres are, do you think we'll see something similar in, the digital warfare realm? And then maybe if you have time, speak a little bit to what you think deterrence could be. Should there be, kinetic ramifications for digital crimes? Or is it, if it's digital, it stays digital? Thank you.
Michael, why don't we go to you? Most of that I thought intersected with your comments. So
Okay, so I'll take a crack at some of this, but unfortunately, I'll kind of cut to the conclusion first. I really think, unfortunately, it's going to take something on the order of a 9/11 or a Pearl Harbor or something of that magnitude to get properly focused on this issue. To the governance and regulation and the rules and the norms that have eventually been established about chemical and biological weapons,
right.
Those all began to get negotiated in 1949, since updated, but that's where we are.
After we had learned what they would do.
Through 20 plus years of industrialized mass murder on a scale never before seen in the history of humankind, it took that to start a set like, hey, I'm grossly editorializing here, but hey, time out, everybody. We can't do this anymore. We're going to wipe out humanity. Don't forget, atomic bombs were dropped. So, let's get our arms around this. Well, we haven't even started that with data. There's some fascinating presentations, again, given yesterday and today, and some encouraging words, but that is what keeps me up at night.
Good answer. Let's go right here then to the next question. This will be our last question.
Testing. Jessica circled around the question that I'm going to ask.
All right.
But didn't quite hit on it. I'm Sasha Rojava, and I'm the Director of Counter Foreign Malign Influence Strategy at Def9 Solutions. We've been we've been meandering around the subject of cyber and cognitive warfare as a precursor and a satellite to kinetic warfare. And as far as kinetic warfare is concerned, there has historically been an understanding of the script of escalation. Right? There's a sequence of steps, one thing leads to another, and warring parties, typically states, state actors, they understand what it is. That is not quite the case in the realm of, in the cognitive and cyber battlefields. So my question is bifurcated and it's somewhat leading. So 2 questions. How important is it for us to have a grammar of escalation in the cyber and cognitive battlefields? And how feasible would it be to actually establish such a grammar?
Jessica, can we turn to you on that one? That's a hard question.
It's a really hard question
for any of us. So I want to give it to you. The best one, best prepared to answer it.
So I think it's incredibly critical that we do have a grammar and a logic for escalation. Do I think it's feasible? I'm not sure yet. I don't know that until we really sit back and figure out what is and I hate this expression, but unfortunately, like what is that cyber 9/11 or what is that cyber Pearl Harbor? I don't know that we're going to get there yet. But I do think, one of the examples that I took a sigh of relief of was, when Iran shot down that drone and everybody's like, we need to strike back on Iran. And President Trump was like, oh, we're going to kill like 250 people for a drone. Wait, I thought that's why we had drones, so that we didn't escalate, right? So there was a moment of rationality there that we didn't, strike back over killing a machine, which I was grateful for in a lot of ways, because also when you look at the territory of Iran, no, for a variety of reasons. But so I think your question is really, really important. We do need to think through what does this escalation look like, and what does that language look like? But we also have to fix the attribution problem, and that's really critical. If we can't attribute, we can't escalate or de-escalate, and that is a problem from individual level attacks, right? When people are posting revenge porn about someone, to nation states. So the attribution problem, I think, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the anonymity allows people to stand up against the repressive governments, et cetera. It also allows bad actors to take, advantage of that anonymity. I can talk and do nefarious things. So I think until we can solve the attribution problem in some way, we're not going to get to the grammar of escalation that we need to really think through. Like, if this, then this.
Great. Well, good answers. And thanks to you, Jessica. Thanks, Mike. And thanks, Kiril, for joining us today. Thank you all for joining the conference. And that wraps it up. Do we have a great event like after this, after party or something? All right. Happy hour. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.